Most people will live their entire lives and never figure out what I'm about to tell you in the next 20 minutes. They'll work 40 years, hand their money to a bank that pays them practically nothing, watch inflation quietly eat their savings alive, and then retire on a prayer and a Social Security check that barely covers their groceries. And here's the painful part. It is not because they didn't work hard enough. It's because nobody ever sat them down and told them the truth about money. Nobody showed them the map. So today that changes. Because I'm going to show you why $19,000, that specific number, $19,000, is not just a savings goal. It is the exact moment your financial life stops being ordinary and starts becoming something completely different. Stay with me. Because if you miss what I'm about to say, you may spend the next decade chasing the wrong targets entirely. My name is Richard Calloway. I built my first business from a rented office in Chicago with $1,100 and a phone I could barely afford to plan on. I grew that business, sold it, invested the proceeds, lost some of it, rebuilt, and eventually crossed $100 million mark before I turned 52. I've since been involved in real estate, private equity, and a handful of ventures that most people will never hear about because that's how real wealth actually works. Quietly, methodically, without the noise. I'm not here to sell you a course. I'm not here to flip you a program. I'm here because I watched too many brilliant, hard-working Americans spin their wheel for decades because they never had access to the kind of financial thinking that people in my circle take for granted. So if you're someone who is serious, and I mean genuinely serious, about building financial independence, about understanding how money actually moves in this country, then make sure you hit that subscribe button right now. Because everything I put on this channel is designed to give you the exact framework that wealthy people use, and that nobody in mainstream finance wants to explain to you for free. Now, let's get into it. You might be wondering why I picked $19,000 specifically. Why not $20,000, which sounds cleaner? Why not $15,000, which feels more achievable for a lot of people starting out? The answer is that this number is not arbitrary, and it is not a round number chosen for convenience. The figure $19,000 sits at the intersection of three separate financial realities that most people never connect to each other. And when you understand all three at once, you start to see money in a completely different way. The first reality is behavioral. The second is mathematical. And the third is structural. Meaning it has to do with how the American financial system is actually built and how you can use that structure to your advantage in ways that the average person simply doesn't know about. I want to walk you through all three, and I want you to pay close attention to each one, because each one builds on the last. Let's start with the behavioral reality, because this is the one that trips up the most people and costs them the most money over their lifetime. There's a concept in behavioral economics called the savings threshold effect, and what it describes is the point at which a person's relationship with their own money fundamentally changes. Below a certain level of savings, most people, and I mean most people, regardless of income, still think about their money in terms of spending. They think about what they can buy, what they can afford, what they can do this weekend. Their mental model of their bank account is essentially a consumption budget. But something shifts when that account crosses a threshold. Suddenly, the money stops feeling like fuel for spending and starts feeling like a resource, something with potential, something worth protecting, something that could do something if you pointed it in the right direction. Research from behavioral economists, including work referenced by institutions like the Federal Reserve, has consistently shown that this shift tends to happen not at $10,000, not at $25,000, but somewhere in a range of $15,000 to $20,000. And I can tell you from decades of watching real people navigate real financial decisions that $19,000 is right in the heart of that zone. When you cross $19,000 in liquid savings or investments, you stop being a consumer who occasionally saves, and you start being a saver who occasionally consumes. That is not a small distinction. That is the difference between building wealth and treading water for the rest of your life. Now let's talk about the mathematics, because this is where it gets viscerally real in a way that most finance channels never bother to show you. Everyone has heard of compound interest. Every personal finance book mentions it. But hearing about compound interest and actually feeling what it does at $19,000 versus what it does at $5,000, those are two completely different experiences. Let me show you exactly what I mean. If you have $5,000 sitting in a high-yield savings account right now, a rate of roughly 4.5%, which is a realistic rate in today's environment, you are generating approximately $225 per year in interest. That is less than $20 a month. That barely covers a dinner out in most American cities. It's not nothing, but it doesn't feel like anything either. It doesn't change how you think. It doesn't change what's possible. Now take that same 4.5% rate and apply it to $19,000. Suddenly you're generating $855 per year in interest. That's over $70 a month. That's a car payment. That's a utility bill. That's real money that you can see and feel, and that begins to matter in the context of your monthly financial life. But here's what I really want you to understand. It's not just about the interest income. It's about what happens when you take that $19,000 and move it out of savings account and into something that actually grows. The S&P 500 has returned an average of roughly 10% annually over the last 50 years when you account for dividend reinvestment. There are no guarantees in investing. I've lived through enough downturns to know that viscerally, but the long-term trajectory of the American economy has been upward, and positioning yourself correctly to capture that growth is one of the core disciplines of building wealth. So when you take $19,000 and invest it in a broad index fund, something like a total market fund or an S&P 500 index, and you leave it alone for 20 years while adding to it regularly, what happens? At 10% average annual growth, $19,000 becomes over $127,000 in 20 years without you doing anything except not touching it. That is the power of compounding at scale. At $5,000, the same 20-year journey gets you to about $33,000. The difference between starting at $5,000 and starting at $19,000 is not $14,000 at the end of 20 years. It is nearly $100,000. Every single dollar you add in the early stages of your wealth-building journey is worth far more than a dollar added later. This is a mathematical fact, not an opinion. And understand it in your bones is what separates people who build real wealth from people who always feel like they're almost there. Now, this is the part that I find most people have genuinely never heard before, and it's the part that makes it the most animated, because when I learned this, and I didn't learn it until my late 30s, which is one of my few genuine financial regrets, it changed how I thought about every dollar I was managing. The American tax and retirement system is built around specific contribution thresholds, and once you understand those thresholds, $19,000 takes on an entirely new meaning. Let's start with a 401k. In the current tax year, the IRS allows you to contribute up to $23,000 annually into a traditional 401k if you're under 50 years old. Now, that $23,000 annual limit is the ceiling. But most financial advisors, not the good ones, but the average ones, will tell you to contribute enough to get your employer match and then stop. That is, in my experience, deeply flawed advice for anyone serious about building wealth. The 401k is one of the most powerful tax advantage vehicles the government has ever created. The money goes in pre-tax. It grows tax-deferred. And depending on your tax bracket, contributing aggressively to your 401k could save you thousands of dollars per year in federal income taxes alone. The connection to $19,000 is this. When you have crossed that threshold in your savings, you have proven to yourself that you can control your spending. You have demonstrated the discipline necessary to begin maximizing these tax advantage accounts rather than just dipping a toe in. The $19,000 milestone is the psychological evidence that you are ready to play the long game. Now let's layer on the Roth IRA. For 2024 and into 2025, the contribution limit is $7,000 per year for individuals under 50. A Roth IRA is funded with after-tax dollars, which means the growth and the withdrawals in retirement are completely tax-free. The IRS lets you take your money in retirement with zero federal tax burden on those gains. If you are in the early or middle stages of your career, the Roth IRA is arguably the single most powerful wealth-building instrument available to the ordinary American. And here's what very few people understand about the mechanics. The Roth IRA has income phase-out limits, meaning if you earn above a certain threshold, roughly $161,000 for single filers in 2025, your ability to contribute directly begins to phase out. But here's the thing. By the time you've crossed $19,000 in savings and started investing properly, you are building toward a financial life where those income phase-outs become relevant. You are building toward a version of your life where these structural details of the tax code matter enormously. Getting comfortable with them now, at the $19,000 mark, is exactly the right time. And then there's the HSA, the health savings account, which is, and I say this with complete conviction, one of the most underutilized wealth-building tools in the entire American financial system. If you have access to a high-deductible health plan, you can contribute $3,850 per year as an individual or $7,700 as a family into an HSA. That money goes in pre-tax. It grows tax-free, and it comes out tax-free for qualified medical expenses. Triple tax advantage. No other account in the American system offers that. And if you invest your HSA funds, which most people don't even know is an option, it behaves essentially like a second retirement account. At $19,000 in savings, you have the runway to begin funding all three of these accounts simultaneously. And that combination, 401k, Roth IRA, HSA, is the foundation of what I call a tax-efficient wealth stack. This is how you stop paying the IRS more than you legally have to. And it is how you start building the kind of compounding machine that changes your family's financial trajectory permanently. I want to spend some time here on the psychology, because in my experience, this is what separates the people who actually do it from the people who understand it intellectually, but never quite make it happen. Money is psychological before it is mathematical. I know that sounds counterintuitive coming from someone who just spent 10 minutes talking about compound interest and IRS contribution limits. But I've sat across the table from people with advanced degrees in economics who couldn't hold on to $20,000 to save their lives. And I've watched people with high school diplomas and modest incomes quietly build seven-figure net worths over 3 decades. The difference was always in their heads before it was ever in their accounts. Here is what happens to a person's psychology when they cross $19,000. The first thing that changes is what economists call your loss aversion threshold. Below a certain level of savings, people treat their savings account the same way they treat their checking account, as a pool of money available for spending when something compelling enough comes along. A vacation, a car upgrade, a kitchen renovation. The money is there, the desire is there, and there's no psychological barrier strong enough to stop the spending. But once you cross $19,000, something shifts. That money starts to feel like the beginning of something real. You start to feel, for perhaps the first time in your life, that you have genuine financial options. You feel less desperate about your income because you know that if something went sideways tomorrow, you could handle it for a few months without catastrophe. That feeling, that cushion of genuine security, is not a small thing. It changes how you negotiate your salary. It changes how you respond to financial pressure at work. It changes how you make decisions about risk. People with real financial cushion make better decisions across every dimension of their financial life because they are not operating from a place of scarcity and fear. The second psychological shift is what I call the wealth identity transition. Below the threshold, most people identify as someone trying to save money. Above it, something changes in how you see yourself. You begin to identify as someone who is savings, as someone building towards something. And that identity shift matters because our decisions follow our identity. When you believe, genuinely believe at the identity level, that you are the kind of person who builds wealth, you start making different choices without consciously thinking about them. You negotiate differently. You spend differently. You invest differently. This is not motivational speak. This is documented behavioral psychology, and it is one of the most important things I can share with you today. Getting to $19,000 is not just a financial milestone. It is an identity transformation. And identity, in my experience, is the single most powerful driver of long-term financial outcomes. Now, I know some of you are watching this from a place where $19,000 feels like a long way away. Maybe you have $2,000 saved and you're living paycheck to paycheck. Maybe you have $8,000 and you've been stuck there for 2 years. Maybe you have $14,000 and you can see the finish line, but you can't quite figure out how to get over it. I want to speak directly to each of those people because the path to $19,000 is not the same for everyone. And the advice that works for a 25-year-old making $45,000 a year is different from the advice that works for a 40-year-old making $90,000 who just hasn't gotten their financial act together yet. The first thing I want to say is this. The emergency fund and the investment account are not the same thing, and conflating them is one of the most expensive mistakes I see people make. Your emergency fund, typically 3 to 6 months of essential expenses, should be liquid, accessible, and sitting in a high-yield savings account. This is not your wealth-building vehicle. This is your financial immune system. It protects you from having to sell investments at the wrong time, from going into high-interest debt when life happens, and from making desperate decisions when the car breaks down or the furnace goes out. For most Americans, a proper emergency fund is somewhere between $8,000 and $20,000, depending on their monthly expenses and the stability of their income. If you're a W-2 employee with stable income and low monthly expenses, 3 months is probably fine. If you're self-employed, commission-based, or in a volatile industry, you want closer to 6 months and maybe more. Getting this right matters because without it, every unexpected expense becomes a financial crisis. And financial crises have a way of wiping out months or years of disciplined saving in a single weekend. The second thing I want to say is about income. And I'm going to be direct about this because too many financial channels talk only about cutting expenses and never address the income side of the equation with any real honesty. You cannot cut your way to wealth. You can absolutely cut your way to financial stability, eliminating high-interest credit card debt, stopping unnecessary subscriptions, cooking at home more consistently. All of that matters, and it matters a lot in the early stages. But beyond a certain point, the leverage is on the income side. If you are making $50,000 a year and you spend every waking moment optimizing your budget, the mathematical ceiling on your savings rate is still pretty low. But if you can get your income to $75,000 or $100,000 through a promotion, a career pivot, a side business, freelance work, or developing a high-value skill, suddenly the $19,000 milestone goes from a multi-year journey to something you can accomplish in 12 to 18 months. I want you to think about income expansion as a financial strategy, not just career advancement. Every additional dollar of income that you don't inflate your lifestyle to absorb is essentially found money that goes straight to building wealth. On the expense side, the single highest leverage decision most Americans can make is around housing. Housing typically represents 30 to 40% of a household's after-tax income, and the decisions people make about where they live and how much they spend on housing have more impact on their ability to save than every other spending category combined. I'm not going to tell you that you need to live in a van or move back in with your parents, though frankly, for a very short and strategic period, I've watched people do exactly that and leapfrog a decade of normal saving in 2 or 3 years. What I'm going to tell you is that the cultural narrative around housing in America, the idea that you need to maximize a home you can afford, that renting is throwing money away, that you need to keep up with the neighborhood, is one of the most financially destructive stories that our culture tells, and it keeps millions of Americans house poor and savings poor for decades at a time. The FICO score you need to get a good mortgage rate, the debt-to-income ratio lenders look at, the opportunity cost of tying your capital up in a liquid asset when you're young. These are all conversations we're having. And the people who have them early tend to make substantially different and substantially better housing decisions than the people who let culture and peer pressure drive the choice. Let me get specific now, because specificity is where real action comes from. What should you actually do with the money when you cross $19,000? How should you think about deploying it? This is a question I get most often from people who are close to the milestone, but aren't quite sure what happens next, and the answer is more structured than most people expect. The moment you cross $19,000, I want you to do a very specific audit of your financial structure. First, identify how much of that $19,000 is genuinely emergency fund, money that is not to be touched under any circumstances except a genuine emergency, and how much is capital available for investment. For most people with moderate expenses, $6,000 to $10,000 is the right emergency fund floor. That means that if you've saved $19,000, you potentially have $9,000 to $13,000 of investable capital sitting idle, waiting to be put to work. That idle capital is costing you money every single day it sits in a checking account earning nothing. Second, I want you to look at your 401k contribution rate and ask yourself honestly whether you are maximizing it. If your employer offers a match, say, for percent of your salary matched dollar for dollar, and you are not contributing at least that 4%, you are literally walking away from free money. That employer match is an instant 100% return on your contribution. No investment in the world gives you a guaranteed 100% return. And yet millions of Americans leave this money on the table every single year because they feel like they can't afford to contribute. If you've gotten yourself to $19,000 in savings, you have demonstrated the discipline to find more room in your budget. Find the room for the full match. It is non-negotiable. Third, if you have any high-interest debt, and by high interest, I mean anything above 7 or 8% annually, so credit card debt especially, the $19,000 milestone is the moment to get aggressive about eliminating it. The math is simple. Paying off a credit card that's charging you 22% interest is equivalent to getting a guaranteed 22% return on that money. You will not find that return anywhere in the market on a risk-adjusted basis. Debt elimination at high interest rates is one of the highest return financial moves available to most Americans, and is one that is completely under your control. Fourth, and this is where I want you to start thinking about your investment identity. I want you to think about asset allocation. Once your emergency fund is properly funded, your 401k match is captured, and your high-interest debt is eliminated or aggressively on its way to being eliminated, the remaining investable capital should be moving into the market in a diversified, low-cost, index fund-based portfolio. The research on this is overwhelming and has been for decades. Actively managed funds, on average, underperform their benchmark indexes over any period longer than 10 years. The fees on actively managed funds, expense ratios that can run from 1 to 2% annually, seem small but are absolutely devastating to long-term compound growth. 1% of $1 million is $10,000 per year that you are paying to someone who is, statistically speaking, underperforming the market. Low-cost index funds from providers like Vanguard, Fidelity, or Schwab have expense ratios that are often below 0.1%. The difference, compounded over 30 years, is staggering. At $19,000 in investments, choosing low-cost index funds over high-fee actively managed funds could mean the difference of hundreds of thousands of dollars by the time you reach retirement age. I want to zoom out now, because I don't want you to walk away from this video thinking that $19,000 is the destination. It is not the destination. It is the launch pad. And the most important thing I can tell you about what comes after $19,000 is that the discipline, the systems, and the identity that got you to $19,000 are exactly what will carry you to $50,000, and then to $100,000, and then to $250,000 and beyond. The skills compound just like the money does. There is a well-documented financial phenomenon sometimes called the first $100,000 rule. Charlie Munger, one of the greatest investors in American history and Warren Buffett's longtime partner at Berkshire Hathaway, was known for saying that the first $100,000 is the hardest to save. Once you have $100,000 working for you, the compound growth starts doing heavy lifting. At 10% annual growth, $100,000 adds $10,000 per year to your net worth without you doing anything. That's a meaningful contribution to your annual progress. At $250,000, it adds $25,000 per year. At $500,000, it's $50,000. You start to see how this machine builds on itself. But the road from 0 to $100,000 goes through $19,000, and the road from 0 to $500,000 goes through $100,000. Every milestone is the launch pad for the next one, and the $19,000 mark is the one where the machine first starts to feel real. I also want to say something about the difference between net worth and savings, because conflating these two things leads people to make very expensive decisions. Your net worth is the total value of everything you own: savings, investments, retirement accounts, real estate equity, business interests, minus everything you owe: mortgage balance, car loans, credit card debt, student loans. Your savings rate is a percentage of your income that you're adding to your net worth every month. These two things interact in profound ways. A person who earns $100,000 a year and saves 30% of it is adding $30,000 to their net worth annually. A person who earns $150,000 and saves 10% is adding $15,000. The higher earner is actually building wealth more slowly. This is why lifestyle inflation, the tendency to increase your spending proportionally as your income rises, is one of the most wealth-destructive forces in American financial life. The goal is to increase your savings rate over time, not just your income. Every time you get a raise, The question is not, what can I afford now? But how much of this raise can I direct into my wealth building accounts before I adapt to the higher income, do the next right thing, and then the next one after that, and trust that the compounding of money, of discipline, of identity will do the rest. If this video gave you something valuable today, do me a favor and share it with someone who needs to hear it. And subscribe if you haven't already, because everything I am putting on this channel is designed to give you the financial literacy and the strategic clarity that changes the trajectory of your life. This is not entertainment. This is a blueprint, and you now have it. I'll see you in the next one.